Hello and welcome to this month's Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. I'm Denise Beck here with Sarah Helkeman.
Hey, Denise.
We are so excited to bring you this month's guest, Sue Eenigenburg, author of several books in the cross-cultural space for women especially that have been really meaningful. Sarah, what are some of the books that Sue has written that have impacted you?
Yeah, one of the first books that I read by her was Expectations and Burnout, which she wrote with another woman, Robin Bliss. And I read that when I was in the midst of like a really hard season on the field, struggling with burnout and not realizing what was wrong. Like it was kind of in this time when I thought, I'm going crazy. I don't know why I can't do these things, why I'm struggling in this way. And so, yeah, there are still actually some stories and images from that book that I still think about all of these years later. So, yeah, Sue's work has been really impactful in the cross-cultural worker community. And so I love that in this episode with her, we get to dive into some of those stories from the books that she has written and what was on her heart as she put those stories together, and really the importance of the legacies that we are leaving as we tell our stories.
Yeah. I was impacted by the fact that her ministry has spanned nearly 3 decades of investing in cross-cultural service and 4 continents, raising children, going as a grandma, leaving grandkids on the field, and just like her breadth of experience in the cross-cultural field and how she writes really directed toward women and the issues that face them. So even Expectations and Burnout is not general. It is as it impacts women on the field. And so, here in the Legacy podcast, we like to tell the stories that impact women and give them the courage to keep living their story as a cross-cultural worker. And sometimes they're stories of women in the past, and sometimes they're living legacies. And so this month, so excited to bring the living legacy story of Sue Eenigenburg to the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. We hope you enjoy it. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled to be here today with Sue Eenigenburg. Sue, thank you so much for being here.
It is a delight.
Sue, as you know, Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast, we love to just highlight and tell the stories of women and their service on the field. I would love it if you could just give us a little bit of an overview of your life on the field. I know you're joining us today from the U.S., so tell us, a little bit of bookends about your time in service on the field through 4 continents, I believe.
Yeah. Well, when I was growing up, the church I attended was very focused on global work. And so I was always willing to go. But, I'd read all of these biographies of people, and I was just not like them. I never read a biography about a lady who loved to play basketball. I have no sense of direction at all. And I'm not adventurous. I'm not brave. And I read all of these stories, and I'm like, well, I would really love to do it, but I am not that way. And so when my husband and I he was in seminary, and we were challenged again by the great need. And so I thought, well, I am willing, and God made me the way that he did. And so let's just go. And God just kept opening doors. So we started out doing church planting for about 12 years in the Middle East. And wow, it was so different from what I expected. And the training helped, and the things that we did to prepare to go were very helpful. But I didn't feel very useful on our team, because I wasn't one of those people who could sit next to someone like on an airplane, share the gospel, and before you know it, they come to know Christ. So I didn't feel needed, right? And so, but once we had believers and I was able to start like discipling, that made a huge difference. But the other thing that enters the picture is that I had such a heart for other women like me who were serving across cultures, who were struggling with, culture stress and language, and how do you balance ministry in your home and ministry outside in the community. And I had such a heart for them that I just started reaching out and, doing things to help them. But that was really hard because I had so idealized that trailblazing, fearless, successful evangelist as the ultimate global worker my role just didn't seem, as important to me. Yeah. So it's just kind of, that has always been alongside of everything I've done with church planting or ministering across cultures. It's just that heart for people like me.
Oh, and so how long did you serve cross-culturally?
The first time we did it in 2 stints, right? The first time we were 12 years, and then we came back to work at our US office, and that was another 12 years. And then we went back, we were in South Asia and in Europe for a total of 13 years. So yeah, out of like 39, it was like 25 years or something like that when you add them together, but in different stints.
But you were definitely in the whole cross-cultural service pot, your whole career being stateside with your home office okay,
Yeah.
so I'm putting together this picture of your service in my mind. Tell me about your kids. Were they born on the field? Were they the first 12 years? Did they go back with you?
Yeah. So when we left the first time, they were 5, 3, and 6 months old. And then we had our fourth one during language study, which experts say don't do. But,
Never.
we take those gifts when God gives them, and I'm delighted. And then when we came back, they were like 17, 15, 13, and 11. And then we were here for 12 years. And we left to go to South Asia, I think 1 month after my youngest daughter got married. So the kids didn't go back with us overseas.
You've done raising the kids and then going back while your kids and now grandkids also began lives over here. So without them, tell me a little bit about those 2 different seasons and your heart as a mom during those times.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was really hard going overseas with little kids. And I remember with my boys, the first 2 are boys, and we did the baby dedication. And it wasn't an emotional thing for me because I knew where I was and I knew what was happening and what our plans were. And then as our gaze shifted to go overseas with my daughter, the baby dedication, I was a mess because I didn't know what was next. I didn't know where we were going to be or how she was going to do, or, it was just so unsettling. But even picturing all that, when we left to go overseas the second time and I left my grandkids and my kids, that was really hard. I remember standing in church singing, songs like I Surrender All and just crying and weeping because I wanted to surrender. But it was just so much harder to leave family than to take them with us. So, yeah, it was rough.
Absolutely.
But I think what Jesus spoke into my soul during one of those church services is the question, am I worthy? Like, am I worthy of the sacrifice that you're making? And I felt like he understood the sacrifice of my heart, but also just that challenge of, am I worthy? And, picturing when I was growing up, my relationship with my grandma, and all my memories were like at her house. I would go to her house and we would do things together. And I was going to where I wouldn't have a house that they could come to, and thinking that would make me a worse grandma. But then coming to the realization that it's not worse, it's different. They'll have memories of me on Skype. They'll have memories of our visits, so it's not worse, it's just different. But just being able to still influence them as a grandma, whether I'm living near them or living far from them, was my heart's desire. And I think God just amazingly provided, the technology we have today and visits that we could do, and they would come see us sometimes. So yeah, that was a very different experience going without family.
I think about even those stories that you said were inspiring you to even want to be there, and that they didn't have that technology, that for them being a grandma meant you're not going to be in person, with them, and sending, all the boarding schools or choosing to send. Some of the stories Sarah and I have covered, the gut-wrenching heart of actually you have to go to a totally different continent to go to school if you want education, and I sacrifice. So, in some ways, super thankful that the Lord has allowed technology to be something that serves the global worker community as well as the rest of the world.
My mom would tell me, well, you have it easy compared to what she felt when we left to go overseas. And I'm like, well, God knows what we can handle.
Right.
She could handle more than me.
Seriously, sometimes Sue, you say that, sometimes I think like, I feel like the Lord must have thought this girl cannot cut it in any other time than the technology makes things super easy,
Right.
you know, like so grateful, but also not a true vote of confidence. Everything is so much easier now than packing in a coffin and heading out than like it used to be. So, okay. So Sue, one of the things that a lot of people who are listening might know you for is your works as an author. And several of the books that you have written have books that have really ministered to the global worker community. I'd love to know what was that process like of you becoming an author? And just for those of you that are listening, some of your books include Screams in the Desert, which is more of the funny side, but also to your latest book, which I believe is Grit to Stay, Grace to Go. Really about those hard decisions we wrestle with about, what does this mean for me if I actually leave? Is this me giving up, or is this me working with the Lord through, it's time for me to go? So talk a little bit about this process of offering these words to the global worker community.
Yeah, well, our organization used to do a quarterly newsletter for women. And so I would write little stories of things that happened. Some were funny, some were awful. But in hindsight, they were funny, right? But I would write those, and it was very healing for me to write these out. There's something about that process of writing that just brings balm to my soul, to see God's presence and to write that. And so I would send those off and then never really thought much about them once I sent them off. And then I was at one of our organization, we had an annual conference, and I was with a group of women, and somebody just happened to mention, oh, she's the one who writes Screams in the Desert. And there was this, it wasn't a gasp, it was like this, some noise that made me know that my stories resonated with other people.
Into their hearts.
Right. And it touched them, and it was encouraging to them. And so, I kept writing these stories, but a thought began to, come and develop in my mind about, what if I collected all these stories and put it in a book that would be able to be published? And so I put together like 4 or 5 stories, and I sent them to William Carey Publishing. And I remember sitting at my computer, and I remember writing something like, this isn't the type of book you normally publish. And I was almost embarrassed because there was no strategy. There's no deep thinking. There is some deep thinking, but nothing like, this is how you can become a more effective worker. It was just stories. And my finger hovered over the send button, and I was afraid to send it because it wasn't like other things I've read. What if I was rejected? I hate rejection. I hate failure. And it was just this overall big risk thing. That what happens if I send it in and they write back and say, well, those are just silly stories, but the thing is they published it. They decided to publish it, which was so exciting. But when I got my first copy, I stayed up that night and read through the whole thing, and my heart started pounding, and I'm just like, what have I done? Because when you do one story at a time, it's okay. But when you read them all together, it's like, we're going to lose support. People are going to wonder how in the world our organization let her in. All of these doubts of just these, stories of weakness, or stories of when I doubted God, or I was afraid of God, things like that. It was just too much. And so I take the book, I go up to my husband, and I said, I've changed my mind. And he said, well, I think it's a little late for that. And I'm like, oh no. But the thing that was just amazing to me is that we didn't lose support. But people could relate to the stories. People could understand because they are weak too sometimes, or they are afraid too sometimes, or they do things that don't make sense at times. And so I just found that sharing those stories, or the weaknesses, or the foibles, or whatever, made people relate to me more and would start more in-depth, heartfelt conversations
What season was this in when you wrote that first book? Was this in your first chunk on the field or
Yeah,
your second? Yeah.
it was at the very beginning. And the thing about writing the funny stories is sometimes there's just a lot of tears
Hmm.
behind the story, right? But
Sure.
you kind of work your way through it to where you find the lightness of it. And I think one of the ways God made me is to touch my life with humor. He made me to love stories, and he communicates. I don't know. It's not like we share jokes, right? But it's like there are things that happen, and he has a way of showing the humor in it. So, for
Mm.
instance, when we were in the Middle East and things were like really hard, and I'm like, I can't believe we're here. I don't know what's going to happen. And I started thinking about all those stories of workers who would say to God, anywhere but Africa or anywhere but. And so I thought, well, I could like say anywhere but Hawaii,
Anywhere.
and see if I could like
But
do
by
reverse psychology with God.
yeah.
Right? And God's like, that doesn't work with me. And you know what I mean? So just
Nice
these
try.
conversations with him that just the things are hard, but he has a way of making a story come out of it and making me laugh.
When you were writing those, did you hear back from women or people with their stories?
What I hear mainly is people would come up and say, I loved your toothbrush story, or I loved you. You know what I mean? They have these specific stories that kind of stand out in their minds. And one of the ladies just came up and hugged me and said, thank you.
Mm.
And I don't know, things like that are
Yeah.
just very special because it shows God's able to use weak things. God's able to use humor.
Yeah.
One of the things that happened when we were in an airport, or I was traveling by myself actually, and I fell, and it turned out I broke my left knee and my right arm, but I didn't know that at the time, right? And
Oh my
so I'm
goodness.
just in pain, and I had to go get things checked out at an urgent care. So they made my ticket for the next day, but they arranged a cart to take me down to where I could wait for my daughter who was going to come pick me up. I was hurting and I was in pain, and this cart takes me and it stops at this really long hallway. And the lady says, okay, just walk down this hallway and go down the escalator, and that's where you'll wait for your daughter. And I'm like, you want me to like walk down that
Walk.
long hallway? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm really hurting. And then I see somebody pushing somebody in a wheelchair, and I see an empty wheelchair by the wall. And I said, well, do you think, I could use a wheelchair? And she said, well, do you have anybody to push it? And I'm like, no. And she goes, just walk down the hall. So I'm leaning against this wall, have my suitcase, my purse, and I'm just like, oh God, help me make it. And I get to the escalator, and I'm going down the escalator, and ahead is where I sit to wait for my daughter, and to the left is the restroom. And I'm like, okay, you're going to need the restroom before you get to the urgent care place. Better to do it now. So I go into the bathroom, and I'm in my own little stall, and it was just me. And I was like at the end of my emotional, spiritual, physical energy level. And I was just getting ready to burst out in tears and just start sobbing. And on that very moment, God, in his kindness, had this song play over the loudspeaker at the airport. And the song was, Big Girls Don't Cry. And I'm sitting in that little stall, and I'm like, I can't believe you had them play that.
Thank you, Lord.
And it's just things like that God just gives little touches of, I'm here. I know you're hurting. I know it's hard, but I'm here. Yeah, just stories like that, because everybody has moments like that where
Yes.
you're all alone and you don't know how you're going to keep going, and God's there and we're not alone.
Okay, so I have to ask, are you a journaler? Do you write regularly just to keep these stories fresh, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I will jot myself little notes about things I remember. I'm a prayer journaler. I have a big container of things that I've written through the years and be able to look back 30 some years to see, how God's been at work. So there is something about writing for me that just brings healing and help, and thinking of stories and finding little nuggets of truth in those stories.
Mm. So, one of the things that Sarah and I have found as we started this podcast and we wanted to tell stories was that there are so many women that don't do that, that don't write down their stories, especially women in the past when it was more men who were writing in this circle, who were publishing articles, who were writing the biographies, and actually finding trouble, like knowing this woman had significant impact in the cross cultural field. And yet we can't find anything from her perspective about what it was like. You know, you have these people writing about her, or we know that there was this work, but you don't hear her inner struggle, these funny moments of in a bathroom stall that nobody else would know about unless she took the time to write them. And so that's one of the things I would also just ask, you know, where our heart was like, how can we encourage women to, even if you don't feel like you're a good writer, even if that these are moments worth recording for, you know, for encouragement, because these stories, when they do find their way out, do what you're saying. They cause women to say, thank you, and give you a hug, and just your story spoke to me and it gave me the courage I needed to keep going, to go out of the bathroom stall and hobble my way down, you know.
Uh-huh,
What would
uh-huh.
you say to women who, you know, have never really thought about, oh, could I'm not the person that is trailblazing. Why would my stories matter? What would you say to them?
Yeah. On a book that I wrote recently, we were trying to come up with a subtitle. We had the title. It was Bags Packed, Hearts Ready. And we were trying to come up with a subtitle. And one of the things we toyed with was this statement. Our legacy unfolds as our stories are told. And
Mm,
I think that our stories, they're a part of our legacy because our stories are going to live on long after we're gone. And I hold in my heart stories that my dad has told me, stories my grandparents have told me, my mom, stories my children have told me, coworkers, friends, that these stories influence me. And I just think as we share our stories, because we're individuals who God touches, that our stories are going to encourage other people. And that is, I believe that's a really strong part of my legacy that I'm leaving behind for family and women who are coming after me. And one of my most thrilling messages recently was from my granddaughter. She's 18. She's in college, and it starts like this: "Hey, Grammy," which is like my favorite kind of message to get.
yes.
I'm going to use Screams in the Desert for my devotional this year. And I'm like, how thrilling is that? That this new generation, she's going to be reading my stories, and God's going to be influencing this loved one. And my other granddaughter has read, and just the generational thing of stories. But also, when I was younger, what I longed for was somebody with experience, somebody with stories who could relate to me. They would get my world. And having people come through who told me their stories encouraged me, or they listened to my stories and they said, oh, that's normal. Everybody
Yeah.
struggles with that. Or, you know, that's, yeah. And just, yeah, I just think that's part of our legacy, because long after we're gone, those are going to be here, and they're going to
Mhm.
point to the God who meets us where we are and who uses us in our weaknesses.
Mm. I was thinking as you were talking about at the, you know, at the beginning of our talk about you don't have a home where your grandkids could come. My thought immediately went to the titles of your books that I'm familiar with, and I'm like, but that's the home they're going to get to repeatedly go back to when they want to visit you, is all of the stories that they're going to get to know and hear and read. And I love that you bring up that your granddaughter is using that book. She's actually going to be sitting in all of your homes that you
Mm-hmm.
talk about in, you know, with you in that story in a way that never would have happened had you not taken the time to write those stories out. So I love that so much, Sue. And I hope that that's an encouragement to women that are listening today to write the stories, even if you don't think that the global community world needs to hear them, but maybe it is your grandkids that need to hear it someday, to come and sit in your home with you for those stories. So, Sue, thank you so much for that. I know Sarah and I just feel really, really strongly about women being able to tell their stories. And sometimes it's in the reflection of your stories where you see that God was there with you all along, that you couldn't see in the moment. But when you tie all the stories together, you see him being there. I wonder, Sue, if you could talk to us a little bit about, your consecutive books as I'm looking. And I'm not even probably looking at all the titles because I wasn't even aware that book you mentioned, Bags Packed, Hearts Ready. Is that your most recent book?
Yeah, it just came out just a couple months ago or something like that. Yeah.
So then was the next book that you wrote The Expectations and Burnout After Screams in the Desert?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so funny thing about that book is when we transitioned off of the field, there was a semester where I taught a class at a university about women serving cross-culturally. And so I was like sifting through all of the resources that were available. It's like, what book do I want to use? And I grabbed that book to teach out of, kind of as a topic for prepping women to go. And so when I was looking up the books you'd written, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that was, you wrote the book that I taught out of for a semester. So that was a
Wow.
fun surprise. But talk to us about, now you've written Screams in the Desert. To me, that came out of your writings, your life you were living, submissions to this news publication you were already being asked to do. So as you transitioned into, actually, maybe I do have something to say, talk about that process and why Expectations and Burnout.
Well, at that point in time, I was doing my master's degree and I had to come up with something to write about. And it was just sad for me to see people come overseas and then leave to burn out. And it was just like, first of all, what causes this? And then what can we do to alleviate that? And so I was working with my advisor, and every topic I came up with, she was like, you have to narrow it. You have to narrow it. You have to narrow it. And just thinking about my own expectations of going overseas, like I don't know, I wanted to be like Billy Graham and Betty Crocker and James Dobson all rolled into one where I would have every area covered. And I wasn't that in my home country. So I don't know what made me think that I would change into that. Right. But just trying to, we all have expectations, but how do we make those not so unrealistic and so high that we end up working and working and working and burn out? And so just started to work on my paper on that. And then once you finish like a thesis paper, you take all the fun out. It's almost like the life is out of it. It's like all this information, but because I'm a storyteller, my friend Robin Bliss had experienced burnout. And so I got in touch with her and I said, what do you think about working on this together? And can you weave your story into all the research so that it's readable and relatable? And so she agreed to do that. And so she kind of weaves her story through there. But it's just, if I see something and I'm like, how can we make this better? Or I think this is a problem, but I'm not sure. Let me research that. So that's how Expectations and Burnout came about. And then I was at a conference put on by Shoulder to Shoulder that talks about singles and cross-cultural work. And just the disconnect, it seemed like, between those who were single and those who were married. And I said, I think this might be something that we could address to find out the issues we think are issues. Can we prove they are by doing research? And so a single gal, Susie Grumelot, said, I would love to write that with you. And so you have a married person, a single person, and you start addressing issues that can be addressed in a way that it's proactive, not reactive. We're not like coming at things defensively or anything. It's just, these are perspectives of what people are saying and how can we as a community address some of those things. So I like finding things that, how can we make it better? Or is this really a problem or do I just think it is? Yeah. So I love research, but I'm not a statistics person. And so I do the survey and I get back all the results. And then I have this wonderful friend, Rosanna Hess, and she goes, send me all that you have and I'll tell you what you know.
Oh, great. My goodness. What a gift.
That's been great. Oh, huge gift. Huge.
So if you were to, so you have Expectations and Burnout, you have Sacred Siblings, you have this Grit to Stay, Grace to Go, and then your latest one, Bag Packed, Hearts Ready. Like, what would you say were the gifts that you were hoping to give the global community from each of those books?
You know, what's thrilling to me is the Expectations and Burnout book. I think it came out in 2010. So that's 15 years ago. And I still
Mm-hmm.
hear people reference it. And that
Mm,
to me is like, okay, this really struck a chord because
yeah.
we just kind of talked about our own expectations. And Robin's story is just so powerful. So having a book that 15 years later people are still referring to, you know,
Yeah.
because everybody has expectations and you have these goals and dreams and visions of what you want to accomplish overseas. And being able to, how do I have high expectations, but also realistic ones that help me keep my eyes on God and not myself and the results I want to see. Having sacred siblings.
Sorry, one thing you said in that book was about expectations versus vision, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
also a great clarity in that as well.
Yeah.
And I liked that you directed it toward women. I think that that was one of the things that made me pick up the book in 2010
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
that it actually focused on women and the specific needs of expectations and burnout in women. So, yeah, so
Yeah.
I agree and I'm so thankful that for that gift to the community. Okay, so Sacred
Yeah.
Siblings.
Yeah. Having teams read that together and
Mm,
say, okay, how are we doing in this area? And am I expecting more community time from you because you're single? Or, you know, one of the things that Susie and I talked about is as a married person, I've dealt with loneliness. And she said, I sometimes thought married people weren't lonely because you have that built in partner. And so just being able to talk about things before they're an issue on a team and having
mm,
organizations do webinars about that and kind of say, how are we doing as an organization and caring for our single people and our married people? What's our training like? Do we need to improve that? So it's, yeah, that to me is when you see people reading and saying, oh, we should change this or we should do this or I didn't know I was doing that. You know, I think those are the
yeah.
gifts that I see in
As
those
a
books is
as a married person on the field, I love that the Lord put Sarah and I together as kind of in leadership roles at Velvet Ashes because we do get to bring perspectives of single
mm-hmm,
and married.
mm-hmm,
And one of the things that I found in that book that was really challenging was asking myself, do I view my single friends as what did you say, younger sisters, younger brothers, you know, like versus fully when they get married, that doesn't all of a sudden make them able to contribute in a more deep way than when they
mm-hmm,
weren't married.
mm-hmm,
And just like that,
mm-hmm,
subconsciously asking, man, do I do that? Is there this unspoken thing in the way that I interact with a single
mm-hmm,
person on my team? And so I
mm-hmm.
really appreciated that as well.
Yeah.
I love the collaborative nature where you're like bringing people in to each book with you. It's not like, oh, let me be the expert myself, but no, let me work with somebody else because it seems like there's always somebody else. So was it Eva Burkholder that
Book
was?
holder, yes. Yeah.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about that book.
What was really fun about that is my whole thing was how can we help people stay?
Hmm.
And so Eva kind of read through what I've written and she goes, so what's your overall goal here? And I'm like, well, you know, we need people to stay. And she goes, but what if God leads them to go? And I'm like, yeah, we should probably
Oh,
talk
does
about
he
that.
do that?
You know, so
Can God
bringing
do
her
that?
perspective, I mean, her member care background, her expertise as a TCK, bringing me back to staying isn't always good.
Hmm.
The question is that we want to focus on in that book is how do we decide prayerfully and not reactively? You know, because I
Hmm.
remember times just wanting to give up and run away. That was my thing is when things got hard, I would like picture my parents' basement where I always felt safe, right? Like I want to go home and live with my
Yes.
parents where I don't have to deal with this kind of stuff.
That is so funny that you say that because I feel like I had that place too. Like when we're somewhere and you're just like, I just wish I was here. I just wish I was not where there's potentially scorpions where I'm going to set my feet down. And so that's so funny to hear you say that your parents' basement was your place.
That's where I pictured I would never had issues there. I was always safe and somebody cared for me there. And I wasn't
Yeah.
facing, I mean, this was especially strong when my husband went in for his first police questioning and just, you know, will he come home? Will I see him again? I mean, I mean, I knew I would probably see him again, but when and where and all that stuff,
Right.
because
Under
we had
what
other
circumstances?
people were going through things. And yeah, and just like, where can I be safe? And then, God again saying, I am with you. You're
Yeah.
not alone. I'm going to take care of you. Yeah. So this whole grit and grace book was just more of, how do we stay well? And when it's time to leave, and when God makes that clear, how do we leave well? And how do we give grace to those who leave before we want them to? Because
Yeah.
that's something we all deal with, right? Lots of hellos and goodbyes in this line of work.
Can I ask, do you find, because you served on the field for a lot of years, and do you find that people's grit factor has changed or gone down, like in the recent years, or is it just our perception of that's changed? I'm trying not to lead with my question, but member care has been
Well,
an evolving.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think we have more options today
Yeah.
than we used to. When you think about people who went over by ship
Hmm.
and they took everything with them, getting back was really hard. It took a long trip and things like that. And now it's like you can get on an airplane and be somewhere. So your options are more, you just have more available now.
And something you said in that book was you develop the grit by staying through some of the hard
Yes.
things. So you can never
Yeah.
develop grit if you always leave at the hard things. So
Yes. I am so thankful that grit can be developed because I had close to none. When we
yeah.
left, I remember trying things, and if I wasn't good at it right away, I would quit.
Done.
Well,
Yeah.
then you're in the middle of language study and you feel like quitting, and it's like, oh no, another day of I've got to get this, because of the goal, the worthiness of that.
Mhm.
So I'm so thankful that if you don't have it, it can be developed. And
That's
even
great.
leaving can require grit. Sometimes it's easier to stay. And,
So true.
it's just like, if I leave, people are going to think I'm a wimp, or if but what is God leading you to do? So sometimes grit involves staying, sometimes it involves leaving, but it can be developed. And that's that spiritual grit. I just love the word grit because
Mhm.
resilience is a beautiful word, but grit's kind of dirty, not dirty, but like
Oh,
it
yeah.
looks like it requires work to develop that.
Well, even as a mom of 4 young adult TCKs, now you're watching them go through different challenges in their life, and you're just like, I'm like, you're living your story that's going to be what you lean on in a decade from now. Like, you're developing that story with the Lord about how He got you through this that you don't have right now because you're just young and you haven't have all the years and the decades with the Lord yet. So it's like, you want to rescue them, but you also like, no, you got to do this because this is going to be amazing for you. You're going to need this story for what's coming so it's like, I didn't use the words, but it's like, develop that grit in this with the Lord right now. I think that's the thing that as I am, connected to Barnabas International, and my husband and I have walked with so many people going to the field, and it's like, yes, I want you to have access to all of the care and we want you to be as healthy as possible. But also, you got to go through the hard things. You can't always be rescued out of everything because you're not going to develop those muscles and the ability to be able to stay. And so it
Right.
is like this tension that you keep, right? Member care is so
Mm-hmm.
important, and sometimes you just have to do hard things
Mm-hmm.
in the balance there. But
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, so your latest book, Bags Packed, Hearts Ready. Tell us how that came out and what that is about.
Well, one of the greatest privileges of growing older is having a longer experience of God's faithfulness. And the stories continue, even though I'm, and getting closer and closer to the 70 number, God keeps bringing stories and keeps teaching me new things and showing me new sides of himself, and collecting these stories and coming up with enough that I think, I think this would be helpful for people who are going through transition or some health scares. I was left in an MRI machine for a little bit longer than I should have been. And I was trying to be really calm about when to press the panic button because they give it to you, right? So I thought, okay, just You haven't heard anything for a while. They're not there. So just count to 100 slowly, and then you can push the panic button. And so I'm counting to 100, and then I push the panic button and nothing happens.
Oh.
And so I'm trying to figure out, how can I escape from this MRI machine? How can I get down that tunnel?
Is this in the U.S.?
They eventually, no.
No. Okay. Okay.
It was in South Asia. And then what happened was they were going to do another this dye that they injected, but they couldn't because of some numbers were off. And so they went to go get a doctor's permission and stuff, but they just left me in the tube. And so they pulled me out and they said, come back next week and we'll do the second part. And I'm like, okay. So I go back the next week and he's putting me in the thing. And I said, well, here's the panic button. I said, well, does it work? And he goes, of course it does. And then he pushes it and nothing happens. He goes, one moment, madam. And then and he leaves and comes back and he says, it's working now. And I thought, okay. But
that's funny.
God was with me in that tunnel. That's the thing. And so these stories, again, going through health challenges or transition, saying goodbye, like being the person who stays.
Yeah.
That was a totally new experience for me when I said goodbye to one of my kids and they were going overseas, and just being in our driveway and walking back home, and that's hard compared to going is much easier than staying and saying goodbye. So just some of those stories that I thought would help with, just transition or health, or just God's with us in every stage of life. Yeah. So that's kind of like, you're ready for transition or where you're going to go or what's happening. And yeah, so those are what some of those stories are about.
I love that. Especially for those who, we as cross-cultural workers sometimes wrap our identity so much in that, and the disorientation that comes when no longer our address isn't some other continent than what our passport says. And how do our stories stop? Are we done now? Like, is what the Lord doing? And I love what you're speaking into, is that our stories with the Lord never stop. And the real work is being done between you and the Lord, no matter what continent you're on. And your story doesn't stop until, it ends where you're actually face to face having stories with him. And so this difference, I love that perspective of, you keep telling the stories that the Lord is writing, no matter what continent that you're on.
I was just going to say, one of the things I think that cross-cultural workers deal with is, if we don't see fruit right away, or if we don't see success how we imagine it to be, that we think we failed or we should quit or go home or whatever. And just to not forget ripples, like the ripple factor, that you can do one thing and it doesn't look like there's any fruit. It doesn't look like anything is happening, but you don't find out until 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later that God actually used that. And so part of our story is putting that out there, not knowing who it's going to touch or who it's going to encourage. And sometimes I'll do a story and I don't hear anything about it. And I'm like, oh, well, that was probably a flop. And, but, you just don't know, because God has such a way of using our stories to touch people. And I don't think we'll know until eternity how God's used our stories, or how he's used our lives, or words that we said that weren't necessarily acted upon or accepted, but we just don't know, because we're these links in a chain. And just to keep trusting God and serving him, embracing our giftedness, however he's gifted us, even if it wasn't what we wanted or not as important as we thought it should be. But that's the gift that God gave us. So we just keep embracing that and trusting him with the outcomes.
At the beginning of this podcast, you talked about you saying, I don't know, I like basketball, and can God use the way that he made me, to serve in that way? Now that you have had all of these years in between and you're looking at your life cross-culturally now, what would you say to that girl back then?
God made you the way that you are for his glory. And if it doesn't compare with other people, that's okay. Like one of my stories in the book is about the wise men who came to Jesus, and they had their gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? And me, because I compare too much. I go, well, why couldn't I bring the gold? That seems much better than the myrrh or the frankincense. I don't even know what myrrh is, right? So that comparison thing. But the wise men, when they came, their focus was on the Savior. not on what each other were bringing. And so I think that is what I would tell myself, is that don't compare, embrace the gifts God's given you and use those, and let him use you as he will, and not to be afraid of embracing those gifts and using them. I think those are the things. And, there was a book a long time ago called Search for Significance. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, next to scripture, that was probably one of the more powerful books in my life. And it talked about how my value as a person isn't based upon other people's opinions, and it's not based on my accomplishments. And that to me was the most freeing thing in ministry, is that whether someone approves of what I do, or they applaud or don't applaud, or, if my gift doesn't seem to compare with another person, that's not where my value lies. And you were talking a little bit about our significance is in Christ.
Yeah.
And basing that, making that the foundation of where we serve from, and not looking at other things or results or things like that. But Jesus, you've made me this way, and I'm just going to serve you the best I can and love you.
I think about, you probably never would have imagined that you would be having this legacy of all of these stories and encouragement that would be actually in the hands of women all over the world, as part of your legacy. And I love that we just get to be so surprised by what God sees in us and what our story could be with him. And I know for many women listening to this, that won't be their story. Their story may not be something they can tangibly hold in their hands, but that same God sees the value and the ripples that their life will have, and just trusting in him. I think about one story that I've just latched onto. Replays in the back of your mind about a girl who was in a taxi cab in a Middle Eastern town, and her conversation with the taxi driver, years later, she had no idea it ended up starting a church planting movement in a country where she didn't even realize that this conversation that she had and so you just never know the ripples, and just trusting that if the Lord is calling you, he sees you, in your ministry will have value in a sphere that hopefully you get to be encouraged by. But even if you don't, knowing that he sees you and is bringing out your gifts in some way. I'm so thankful that you decided to write your stories down. I'm so thankful for the way that you walk into a room and you're assessing, is this a need? Is this something that I could use my voice? Can I grab somebody and do some research and put something useful back out into the world? And I look forward, Sue, to how that doesn't stop just because you're not based in a different country than your passport says right now, and what the Lord might continue to bring to us in this world. Is there anything that you would just say to women who are listening today, who are looking for courage for the spot that they're in, and wondering, is there anything significant in what I'm doing right now?
Yeah. Can I just close with a little story? Because I think it'll kind of speak to that. When we were in the Middle East, and I was wanting to do big things for God, and I wasn't. It didn't seem like anything I did was very big. And so one morning during my quiet time, I don't remember what I read, but my response was, Lord, whatever you want from me, I will do. It could be prison. It could be martyrdom. It could be beatings. It doesn't matter. I love you so much that I want to do whatever it is you call me to do. And then we got this phone call from this guy, Elliot, and he had been staying with us for a while. And then, you know how when somebody spends the night at your house and then you have to like wash sheets, and we had to rearrange our kids and fix dinner and then fix tea and, And it was just like, got kind of tired of doing that. But when he called, I'd had that quiet time. And I said, where have you been? We would love to have you come over. And so he came over, and I rearranged the kids. I had clean sheets on the bed. He spent the night, and the kids left for school. He and my husband left to go where they were going to go. And I go into the bathroom to get ready for the day. And my toothbrush wasn't where I normally kept it. And it was laying on the sink, and there was like blood in the bristles of my toothbrush. And I realized that Elliot had used my toothbrush. And so I'm standing in the bathroom looking at that gross toothbrush, and these are my thoughts. He's my husband's friend. Why didn't he choose my husband's toothbrush? And I can't believe he did that. And then it's like this complaining to God, like, God, I did this for you. I invited him over to spend the night because he needed a place to stay, and I felt bad for him. I'm trying to serve, but look at my toothbrush. I will never find another toothbrush like this. This was my favorite toothbrush of all time. And then, it's like God has this still small voice, and he said, Sue, I think you mentioned prison and beatings and martyrdom. He said, but today, all I wanted was your toothbrush. And I'm like, oh, and sometimes it's so easy to get really big in our thinking. And those are the things that count, like these big things that we do for God. But, I think sometimes what he's looking for is those small things that we have to give day by day that nobody, if I wouldn't have written that story, nobody would know about the toothbrush.
Yeah.
But it was a picture to me of the little things I give God. They don't have to be big, right? Because he can take little things and do ripple effects. The only downside to that story is my kids and I were talking about it one time about how that happened. And my son, he said this, he goes, well, Mom, how do you know he didn't use it before, but rinsed it out? And I'm like, oh, honey, thank you.
Oh my goodness.
Thanks for that picture that will now stay with me for the rest of my life. But anyway, just whatever opportunities we have, big or small, it's for God, and we just do them faithfully.
Mm-hmm. So for all of you listening out there today who maybe are frustrated by the person that just cut you off in the shop line, or the price that just got hiked up on you because of the color of your skin, wherever you're purchasing something, just thank you so much for that. We were willing to give so much more than the inconveniences that we're being asked to deal with today. And that reminder, maybe it's just for you right now as you're listening to this. So thank you so much for not only your time today that you've shared with us, but for your life and your willingness to share that with us, for the courage that we get from your stories to keep going in this life that God has called us to. Thanks so much for being here today, Sue.
And thank you for your work.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for those of you who are tuning in and who follow us and every month look forward to this podcast as it pops up. Thank you to Barnabas International for sponsoring this and making this something that we can offer to the global worker community every month. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast.